have been plenty of games about street gangs, about cowboys, about samurai and stuff like that, but there haven't been a lot of games about Yakuza, which are Japan's organized crime syndicates. That's where Sega's Yakuza comes in. It may look like some sort of Japanese Grand Theft Auto, but it really isn't, so ignore the little mini-map in the lower corner of the screen. This is much more of an action-adventure game, similar to games like Onimusha or even Devil May Cry or something like that, in that it's got a very basic action-adventure framework that has you running from point A to point B pretty much, and then it's got a lot of brawling, which takes the game into this hand-to-hand combat mode where you usually take on about a half dozen enemies at a time as this tough ex-Yakuza named Kazuma Kiryu. The whole premise and storyline of Yakuza is definitely the biggest attraction, but it's not all good. Basically, in the game, you play as a Yakuza with a heart of gold. He's this tough-as-nails guy who's beaten down dozens and dozens of people in his time, apparently, and early on in the game, he takes the fall for one of his friends and basically gets locked away in jail for 10 years. Then he comes back and finds that there's a huge power struggle going on, and there's even the issue of 10 billion in yen gone missing. Then a lovable little girl enters the picture, and so on and so forth. So the story in Yakuza doesn't necessarily go in all the directions you'd expect from sort of a gritty crime drama. Instead, it's got more of these kind of touching and sentimental moments to it, surprisingly, but it also has its fair share of just pure action. Ultimately, the problem with the story is that it falls prey to a number of really predictable clichés, but at the same time, it's got some pretty unpredictable twists to it, and the nice thing about the story is that it does finally tie up nicely, and all the loose ends, all the big questions do get answered. One thing that's disappointing about Yakuza is that almost the entire game takes place in this pretty small district of Tokyo. You run around through the whole thing on foot. You can get into taxi cabs to essentially teleport across the map, but pretty much the whole game is in this little area where you go running from one point to another. The main storyline is pretty much pressuring you to go from one story mission to the next. There are plenty of times during the main storyline when you get into fist fights, but you'll also encounter the role-playing game equivalent of random battles as you just run around. Basically, you'll come up on a thug who'll affront you, kind of say some choice words at you, and then suddenly you're in a fight against like 6 guys. The game's also got some pretty tough boss battles, especially later on, but after a few tries, you're going to figure out the patterns of these guys and be able to beat them. The combat certainly looks great. Kazuma's got a lot of really brutal-looking moves, and he's got sort of these special finishing moves that he can use once he gets powered up after connecting with a few hits. It may come as a surprise that most of the fighting in this game is bare-fisted. It's just you against a bunch of guys also using their fists. Sometimes they'll have baseball bats and golf clubs and things like that. The game handles the look and feel of hand-to-hand combat very nicely. And only very, very rarely will you actually come up against a gun. Guns don't deal a lot of damage to you, they're just kind of annoying to get up close enough to a gun-wielding opponent to actually hit him. To keep things from feeling too repetitive, the game does have sort of a role-playing game experience system built into it. So as you're beating the stuffing out of one guy after another, you're building up points, which you can then spend on 3 different attributes, which basically make you stronger, give you new moves, stuff like that. So you feel like you're working your way up to something, and the system is balanced nicely such that only near the end of the game are you going to start maxing your character out. In addition to all the running around and all the punching people in the face, Yakuza has a number of little mini-games that you can attempt, and little side missions that you could go on to gain more items and more experience points and stuff like that. This stuff sort of helps make the world of the game feel slightly more interactive, but again, since you're sort of locked into this small area, it doesn't necessarily feel like a fully realized world. It just feels like an action-adventure game with a bunch of mini-games thrown into it. It's ironic how a game that takes place during modern times in a real-world setting can still come across as being much more original than most other games out there. And Yakuza definitely makes good use of its premise for the most part. However, neither the story nor the gameplay itself really goes as far as you might want or expect from this type of game, so there's definitely room for improvement here. Nevertheless, there's enough cool stuff in Yakuza and enough just brutal-looking action for it to be well worth a play.